Crummy, Mummy and Me by Anne Fine. Chapter 1. Crummy Mummy. I don't think my mum's fit to be a parent, really I don't. Every morning it's the same, every single morning. I'm standing by the front door with my coat on, ready to go. School starts at 9 and it's already 8:40 or even later, and she's not ready. She's not even nearly ready. Sometimes she isn't even dressed. "Come on," I shout up the stairs. "We have to leave now." "Hang on a minute. What are you doing up there?" Her voice comes all muffled through the bedroom door. "Nothing." "You must be doing something," I yell. "I'm not." "Come down then, we're waiting." "Can't find my shoes." I lean against the front door, sighing. With as much patience as I can muster, I call upstairs. "Where did you take them off?" "I thought I took them off in the bathroom." "Look there, then." "I have." "If you would only put your shoes away neatly at night, we wouldn't have to go through this every single morning." By now, of course, my baby sister's fretting. She's strapped inside her pushchair, and since I put her coat and bonnet on at least 10 minutes ago, and she's still indoors, her head and ears are getting hot and scratchy. She's boiling up into one of her little rages. Already she's trying to tug her bonnet off. "Will you come on?" I shout upstairs. I'm really getting mad now. "I'm coming." "Well, hurry up." At last she comes downstairs. And even then she's never dressed right. You'd think, honestly you would, that we didn't have any windows upstairs the way she chooses what to wear. She certainly can't bother to look through them at the weather. She'll sail down in midwinter, when it's snowing, in a thin cotton frock with short puffy sleeves and no woolly. I have to be firm. "You can't come out like that." "Why not?" "You just can't, I tell her. You'll catch your death. It's snowing out there. It's far too cold for bare arms. You'll freeze." "Oh, put a coat on." But I just stare at her until she goes back upstairs for a sweater. And even then she'll choose something quite unsuitable. She never dresses in the right sort of thing. She'd wear her glittery leg warmers to a funeral if I let her, or if we ever went to funerals. She'd sit on a beach in her thick purple poncho. If she were called in to see the headmaster, she'd rather wear those baggy flowery shorts she found abandoned on a park bench last Easter than anything sensible. Oh, she'd look fantastic, she always does, but not at all like a mother. You have to watch her. You can't let up. At least she admits it. "Oh, I'm a terrible embarrassment to you, Minna," she confesses, buckling on 2 of her best-studded belts. "I'm a crummy, Mummy." Oh, then I feel mean for being so stern. "You're not a crummy, Mummy," I tell her. "You do your best, and I suppose it doesn't really matter what you look like." "You're right," she says, cheering up at once. And then, if you let her, she'd get worse. At least that's what my Gran says, and she should know because she's her mother. I like my Gran. She lives right on the other side of the estate, but she comes over almost every tea time. She picks Miranda out of the cot and coos to her, and then she sits with Miranda on her knee on the only bit of sofa that isn't leaking stuffing. Mostly she tells Mum off. She says now Mum's a mother of 2, it's time she grew up and pulled herself together. She tells Mum she should throw all her safety pin earrings and lavender fishnet tights into the dustbin and go out and buy herself a nice decent frock from Marks and Spencer's. She says Mum ought to take those horrible Punk Skunks records off the stereo before they ruin Miranda and put on something nice and easy to listen to, like Perry Como's Christmas selection. And then, if Mum hasn't already flounced off in a huff, Gran purses her lips together as if she's been sucking lemons, and clutching Miranda so tightly her dummy pops out of her mouth and her face goes purple, She whispers to Mum that she's clearly still very much under the influence of that dreadful... Here she looks around shiftily and drops her voice even lower. I don't even want to say his name in front of innocent children, but you know exactly who I mean. I know exactly who she means too. She means Crusher Maggot, that's who she means. Crusher Maggot is Mum's boyfriend. It was me who first called him Crusher Maggot because that's what he looks like. And when he first started coming round here, I didn't like him. Now I like him a lot. But it's too late, the nickname's stuck. He doesn't mind, though. And now even Mum calls him Crusher Maggot. Oh, Gran disapproves of Crusher. She thinks he's a very bad influence on Mum. She blames him for giving Miranda her nickname, Crummy Dummy. And she particularly hates his hair. She says it's a hideous embarrassment. Crusher's hair's fantastic. He even won a punk hair competition with it once, and his photo ended up on one of those London postcards that tourists sent home to their friends for a laugh. The postcard was called London's Burning, and there's our Crusher, teeth bared, eyes staring, his hair in flaming red and orange spikes, scowling horribly at the photographer. We've got it propped up on the mantelpiece. Gran hates the sight of it. But then again, when Crusher goes to all the trouble of shaving his head, Gran doesn't like that any better. She doesn't like his tattoo. I've even heard her telling our next-door neighbours how common she thinks it is. And they agreed. They're not keen on Crusher either. They don't like the noise his car makes when it starts. If it starts. They say it wakes their children. Personally, I rather like Crusher's tattoo. It only shows up when his head is freshly shaved. It says, Made in Birmingham. And Crusher claims he was, well, on the outskirts. And we don't see it all that often anyway, because whenever he's gone to the trouble of dyeing his hair a different colour, he lets the spikes grow out all over. Crusher dyes his hair pretty often, considering. Since the postcard, he's been green and pink, yellow and purple. Right now, he's blue. Gran and he had a row about it only last week. Crusher just happened to stroll into the kitchen while Gran was dipping breakfast plates into the sink and washing them so we could start on tea. Mum was upstairs doing something in the bathroom, no one knew what, but it was using up all the hot water, Gran said, and I was giving Crummy Dummy her bottle.
"Whatcha, Granny?"
Crusher greeted her cheerily.
"A hot one of those plates you're rinsing is for me."
He's ever so friendly, is Crusher Maggot. I can't think why Gran just can't get used to him, like I did. But she can't. She spun round at the draining board and glowered at him before saying tartly, "You've got your feet well and truly under the table, haven't you, young Maggot?" Baffled, Crusher looked down at his Doc Martens. But Gran kept on at him. She's good at nagging, Gran is. Mum says that I take after her. "Look at your hair," Gran snorted. "It's sky blue. It's dreadful the way you amble around this estate looking like something that fell off the wall at the Modern Art Gallery. I'm horrified that a daughter of mine is prepared even to be seen walking along the street beside someone with hair that shocking colour." "Your hair's blue too," argued Crusher. He was hurt. "You had that perm and rinse and set only last week. Your hair is definitely blue." "A faint bluish tinge, maybe," Gran said, blushing hotly. "Not sky blue." "Not royal blue either," I cried, for Mum had just sailed into the kitchen, and her hair was royal blue. It was the brightest, deepest, richest blue I ever saw. It was bluer than winter afternoons, bluer than the leggings Gran knitted for Crummy Dummy, bluer even than Sophie Howard's gown when she played the Virgin Mary in our nativity play last year. Gran stared. I stared. Crusher stared. Even Crummy Dummy stared. Then Gran and Crummy Dummy both burst into tears. Screamed Crummy Dummy, and she stretched out her arms desperately to me, hoping I would protect her from this blue-topped stranger. "Oh!" shrieked shrieked poor Gran, holding her hand over her heart. Gingerly she stuck out a finger and prodded one of Mum's spikes. "How can you do this to your old mother?" she wailed. "A girl's hair is supposed to be her crowning glory. Royal blue hair, oh, royal blue hair. What will the neighbours think? Answer me that."
"Oh, they'll think she looks fair smashing," said Crusher, "and that she matches the paintwork on my car."
You could tell Gran was shocked. She went pale as a grub.
"I'm warning you two,"
she said in her dangerous voice.
"You're going too far. A mother can only stand so much."
This interested me a lot, for I suspect my mum can stand almost any amount. It's me who cracks. That's why I have a lot of natural sympathy for my Gran. Gran shook her finger at Mum so hard that her new perm and set wobbled on her head like a pale blue jelly.
"If you stay royal blue, I shall disown you. Yes, I shall. I won't come round here any more. I won't babysit for you when you go down to the disco with this barbarian here,"
pointing at Crusher, who looked hurt again.
"I won't talk to you. I'll even cut you dead in the street. You have to choose royal blue hair or your own mother."
Oh, there was a horrible silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Mum just looked sulky. Gran turned to me. Prizing Crummy Dummy out of my arms, she placed a kiss upon her forehead.
"Farewell, sweet babe," she said. "I hope for your sake that your mother sees sense, and we are not parted for too long."
I got a kiss and a speech too.
"Goodbye, Minna, dear," she said. "I know it can be hard when a mother puts maggots before the family."
Oh, I had some sympathy with that as well. I thought it often enough myself, when Mum and Crusher are too wrapped up in giggling together about something silly to pay any attention to me. "Bye, Gran," I said. "I too hope our parting won't last for long." Oh, it did, though. It lasted for days. Gran never visited once. Well, I was pretty upset, I can tell you. I missed her coming over every afternoon and asking me about what happened at school and helping me with my spelling homework. And Crummy Dummy missed her too, you could tell. She took to sitting forlornly with her dummy in her mouth, looking all miserable and deprived. On Wednesday, we caught sight of Gran for the first time since the quarrel. She was stepping out of Mr. Hamid's shop, carrying a bag full of vegetables just as we came over the pedestrian walkway to the shopping centre. I waved and shouted at her through the railings. But since I was with Mum, Gran ignored me and swept off under the concrete arches extremely grandly, like the Queen Mother, pretending she hadn't heard me call. "See where your stubbornness has led us?" I scolded Mum, as Gran disappeared between Vicky's video palace and the boarded-up wool shop. Mum said something rude. I shan't repeat it. But I persisted in trying to reason with her. "Is it worth it just for blue hair?"
"Oh, ask her, not me," snapped Mum,
and pulled me after the pushchair so sharply she practically wrenched my arm out of its socket. So I asked her. I asked Gran the very next time that I bumped into her, picking her way around the muddy patch of the shortcut across the recreation ground. I spread my hands out in what the author of my best Bible stories always refers to as a beseeching fashion. "Is it worth it, Gran, just for blue hair?" I cried. What Gran said was almost as rude as what Mum said. I shan't repeat that either, but I confess to being a little shocked. She is my granny, after all. I left the two of them to it after that. I knew the problem couldn't last forever, because Crusher had told me Mum's blue was the sort that washed out. So I concentrated my efforts on cheering Crummy Dummy, who didn't know that. I made Crusher fix up her baby bouncer. It's not been right since Mum took off half the chain links to wear to a dance. And I made the hole in her bottle a whole lot bigger. She's been sucking and blowing like a smoker when the lift's broken, trying to get the milk out, poor thing. And I cut the feet off the ends of her stripy baby grow suit. I reckon her toes were getting all squashed up. And I waited. But Gran never came, and Mum never even went next door to phone her. It was nearly a week. "Oh, what a stubborn pair of bats," was the only remark Crusher made about the whole sorry business. And then, just as I was despairing, there came the night of the gale. What a night that was! The rain beat down, lashing against the window panes, until every dream turned into a nightmare. It was still dark at breakfast time. Storm water was seeping under the kitchen door and running over the lino in rivulets. The wind was so fierce it would have had Crummy Dummy's bonnet off in a flash if I hadn't insisted Mum leave her with old Mrs. Pitopoulos next door, instead of dragging her out in the pushchair. "I don't need chumming to school," I told Mum, when she was still scouring the cupboards hopelessly for her scarlet plastic bosun's helmet at 7 minutes to 9. "You don't have to come with me." "You don't have to go," she countered irritably. "I do," I insisted. "It's a school day, isn't it? I'm not sick or injured, am I?" "Don't push your luck, Minna," she said, climbing into her wellies and scowling. So we set off to school through the gale. You've never seen anything like it. The street was absolutely clean. All of the litter had been washed away, even the tatty old cardboard boxes outside number 12, and those great lengths of stair carpet on the corner that the dustbin men have refused for 4 whole weeks to shove into their mechanical chewer. The main road was amazing too. Cars were crawling along, with their drivers hunched forward and peering through little arcs on the windscreens. The tyres hurled wide sheets of filthy gutter water up in our faces. Mum spat and cursed. Her wellies were flooded. And just at that moment I noticed Gran. She was staggering out of her cul-de-sac into the wind, fighting her umbrella, which looked just as though it were fighting her back. I squeezed Mum's arm. "Look," I said, pointing. "Gran! And we're going the same way." Mum blinked raindrops off her eyelashes and looked. Then she shouted to me over the wind, "I'm not slowing up, not in this weather, and now I'm this wet I'm not going back either." And with that she strode on with her head down against the spiteful winds and the rain. Gran was striding along almost beside us. She clearly had the same idea. The weather was far too awful to slow up or take a longer route, or go back home and set off again later. She was going to brazen it out, just like Mum. The two of them were practically side by side now, each striding along into the wind, and neither of them so much as giving one tiny little sideways peep at the other. And that was their big mistake, for the oddest thing was happening, the strangest sight. Both of them were changing. It was almost as if the storm were playing its own little private joke on the pair of them. Mum's hair was changing back to its normal colour. First, little streaks started running like tiny, bright blue rivers down her cheeks, over her ears, and down the back of her neck. Her hair was gradually returning to mousy brown, the colour it was before she went royal blue. The dye was washing out, faster and faster, and the spikes were collapsing. The wind was blowing them flat. Mum didn't notice, but by the time we reached the corner, she looked as clean and neat and tidy as she does in the photo that was taken of her at convent school. Gran loves that photo. She keeps it on the mantelpiece at her house in a special fur frame. Mum says it makes her look like a wally, and slams it down on its face whenever we visit. If the frame wasn't fur, she'd have smashed it by now doing that. And Mum wasn't the only one looking different. Gran was changing too. As she marched into the same fierce wind, Her neat little parting was whipped away, and patches of her hair stuck up in clumps, like Crusher's after his football practice. Her hair was wet too, making the blue look bluer. Gran no longer looked like someone who'd been to the hairdresser only 10 days ago. She looked like someone who'd been dragged backwards through a hedge. Then, as we reached the school gates, the wind gave one last amazing flourish. It whipped Gran's hair up into spikes. It whipped a nice neat parting into Mum's straight brown hair, and it whipped the umbrella clean out of Gran's grasp. Mum reached out and caught the handle automatically as it flew past. Then, since she couldn't think of anything else to do with it, she turned to Gran to hand it back. Gran turned to her to take it. Both of them stared. Gran stared at neat, sweet, tidy Mum, looking just like she used to look in her favourite photo on the mantelpiece. Mum stared at punky, spiky blue Gran, looking a bit like Crusher Maggot on a bad morning. Tears came to Gran's eyes first. "Look at you! You look lovely!" she cried, and reached out to give Mum one of her giant hugs. "And you?" Mum squealed with pleasure, hugging her back. "You look smashing! Just smashing! What a wonderful surprise! Oh, you are too, really!" I sighed and shook my head. Then the school bell rang. I walked away, and neither of them even noticed. They were far too busy praising one another for their beautiful hairstyles. It's a good job there are no mirrors hanging on our school wall, I reckoned. But you never know. In my experience, most of their silly squabbles get sorted out in time, if you just ignore them. Chapter 2. A really boring ride in the country. As soon as school finished, I ran straight home. Even though it was a beautiful day, Mum was inside, sitting on the sofa with Crusher Maggot, watching the video and munching crisps. Crummy Dummy was jumping up and down in her cot, as usual, trying to bump her head on the ceiling. I said hello to Crummy Dummy first. "Hi, babe," I drawled in my American gangster voice. "How's life behind bars?" She smiled and dribbled down her chin. Oh, she likes me so much. While I was tickling her tummy, I asked Mum, "What are you watching?" "Horror film," Mum said. "Curse of the Blood of Dracula. Pass the fizzy." I knew she meant the bottle on the table because that was red currant, and red currant was the colour Crummy Dummy was dribbling. I don't care very much for it myself, and especially not while Curse of the Blood of Dracula is on the video. So I gave the bottle straight to Mum. She took a couple of swallows and passed it on to Crusher. He had a slug, then pushed the bottle between the cot bars. "Here, Crummy Dummy," he said. "Have a swig." I sighed. I do get a bit fed up with fighting the same old battles all the time. "You really shouldn't let Crusher give that stuff to the baby," I told Mum. Now Crusher sighed. You could tell that he thought I was nagging. "Why not?" he asked. "It rots her teeth." "She hasn't any," Crusher argued. "They're in there growing," I insisted. "And drinking fizzy is a terrible habit." I turned to Mum. "You really shouldn't buy it," I told her. "It's full of sugar, colourants and additives. It has no goodness in it at all." Now Mum was sighing as well. But let's face it, it's not my fault that I'm forever having to nag. Left to herself, she makes a terrible parent. If I'm not careful, she forgets all my visits to the dentist and lets me stay up way past my bedtime, even on school nights, and never checks I've done my homework properly or changed my socks. I think she ought to make more of an effort, really. I think she ought to run the house a bit better and dress Crummy Dummy up in nicer clothes. And stop everybody calling her that. Her name is Miranda. I think she ought to buy wholemeal bread instead of white sliced. And take that safety pin out of her ear. I think she should stop being cheeky to the man from the welfare and spending the gyro on clothes that glitter and bits for Crusher Maggot's old car. And I don't think that I ought to come home from school on a beautiful afternoon to find her sitting in a darkened room watching the video. There are far better things to do. Oh, I didn't say anything, though. There was no point. The film was coming to an end anyway. A very sticky end. A crush of flailing vampires was slowly drowning in what should have been the blood of Dracula, but looked more like orange squash because the colours on the telly have not been right since Crummy Dummy fiddled with the buttons. Mum stretched and opened the curtains. "Game of cards, Minna?" she asked hopefully. "I can't," I said. "I haven't done my homework yet." "Oh, you could do it later." "No, I can't," I told her firmly. "I want to go down to the laundrette after tea. I'm out of socks." Mum sighed. I don't think she finds me easy. I bet she hopes Crummy Dummy grows up a bit different, more like her, not bothering about things like homework and clean teeth and matching socks and ready to drop whatever she's doing to have a bit of fun. Because Mum is good fun, even if some of the neighbours do tighten up their lips when she strides past in silver boots, and the health visitor thinks she shouldn't have trimmed Crummy Dummy's hair into a Mohican so soon, and I'm always having to go on at her. "Crusher, fancy a game of cards?" Crusher stood up, knocking a pile of crisp packets onto the carpet. "Nah," he said, "I'm off to buy a bit for the car." Mum looked around. Crummy Dummy was the only one left, but she can't play cards. She simply puts them in her mouth and sucks the edges till they're soggy. "It's tea time anyway," I reminded Mum. "Better leave the cards till after." "All right," Mum agreed. But I could see she didn't like it because she dragged her boot heels along the lino, following me into the kitchen. We were out of butter, and out of bread, and out of tea bags. I had to borrow £2 from the emergency tin and leave Mum clattering the dirty breakfast plates off the table while I went down to the shop. And that's how it happened that no one was in the room when the television and the video were stolen. No one except Crummy Dummy, that is. And she didn't raise the alarm. She didn't even make a noise, Mum said. Not one squawk. She just sat there in her nappies and watched. Probably thought it was as good a show as any on the telly when the thief sneaked in through the open front door, past the kitchen where Mum was, and into the room, picking his way softly and carefully through all the crumpled crisp packets lying on the floor ready to crackle, lifting the telly and the video and carrying them out without a sound. He even must have slipped a square of milk chocolate to Crummy Dummy through the cot bars on his way out. We found it dribbled down her after. Everyone realised what had happened at the same moment. Mum came out of the kitchen just as I came back from the shops, and Crusher Maggot strolled in the back door. "Hello," said Crusher. "Where's the telly?" "And the video?" "Gone! Who's taken 'em? Have we had burglars? What's going on?" You can imagine the fuss. Mum nearly had a fit. Crusher was furious. The video belonged to him. He brought it round to our house months ago to tape the cut final and never took it home again. I was just going to mention to Mum how silly it was of her not to have made sure we had proper insurance when Crusher said, "What about Crummy Dummy? She was here all the time. She must have seen whoever it was come in and steal 'em." Mum lifted Crummy Dummy out of her cot and tried to get her to spill the beans. But since you can only say buckle and bye-bye and tack, that's cat backwards, it wasn't any use. Mum soon gave up. "I suppose we'll have to phone the police," she said. "Police?" said Crusher, He didn't sound too keen. But Mum went off next door in her silver boots to borrow their phone. Crusher sat, sunk in gloom, facing the empty space and bare wall that used to be our television and his video. I didn't mind too much. I only watched the nature programmes and the documentaries, and I'm beginning to suspect that television kills conversation. Crusher's conversation was none too interesting. All he kept saying was, "If I finds out who it was, I'll rip his ears off." The police, when they finally turned up, didn't seem bothered. Of course, it wasn't their telly or their video. There were two of them, one old, one young. The old one said this sort of thing happens all the time in an area like ours. He didn't hold out much hope for our getting the things back. He hadn't anyone spare at the moment to send out looking. Crusher glared at him then, as much as to say, "You're not doing all that much yourself, are you, just standing here gassing? Why don't you go out looking?" But the old one didn't notice, and the young one was just leaning against the draining board staring at Mum. You could tell that he disapproved of her and fancied her at the same time. So could the old one. He took him off. 2 seconds after they'd gone, Crusher flung himself face down on the sofa and beat the cushions with his fists. "No!" he howled. "No! Tonight at 10 o'clock! The snooker final!" Great chunks of sponge kept shooting out of the cushions. Poor Crusher was beside himself. Mum and I tried desperately to think of something to distract him. "We could take that nice walk along the deserted railway line," I suggested. "It would do Crummy Dummy good to get some fresh air, and there are some smashing wild flowers beside the track." Mum pretended to throw up in Crusher's old wellies. "All right," I said crossly, "you think of something." She thought of something. A ride in Crusher's car." "Where?" "Down the dog track," Mum suggested hopefully. "No," I insisted, "somewhere nice. In the country." "Boring," said Mum, "really boring." But I'd made up my mind, and Mum was too busy trying to get Crusher Maggot to pull himself together to argue for long enough to wear me down. So off to the country we went in Crusher's car. It's a real crate. Crusher says the reason it's bare and rusty and patches all over is because it's such a good car that it's worth saving up for a proper respray. It eats up petrol and it won't go fast. Crusher says that's a sophisticated design safety feature. But Mum and I think it's because the gear stick's bent and Crusher can't force it into 4th gear. We wouldn't dare to say so, though. He'd stop the car and make us walk. We bowled along. Nobody overtook us. The roads were quite empty. "They're all the time getting ready to watch the snooker," Crusher said bitterly. Trees flashed by on either side. "It's nice to go at a speed where Crummy Dummy can see the birds clearly," I said to Mum. The petrol gauge hovered on full. Then, prizing her boots off, Mum caught the glass in front of it by mistake with her heel, and the needle dropped suddenly to halfway empty. "This was a good idea," Mum said, stifling a yawn. And that was when Crummy Dummy screeched. You've never heard a noise like it. It was worse than the howl Mum let out the day she spilt green nail polish all down her new sequin tracksuit. Crusher threw his foot onto the brake. The car lurched to a halt in the middle of nowhere. "What on earth?" Crummy Dummy was bouncing up and down so hard that her nappy was squelching. "What's the matter with her?" "Oh, well, maybe she's got a pin stuck in her." "Of course she hasn't." I was hurt. "I put that nappy on her." She did it again. She's all excited about something. What's she looking at? Nothing. Well, she must be looking at something. Her eyes are open. I craned my neck round beside hers to try to see what she was looking at. She's looking at that hill over there.
What hill?
That hill. That boring old hill. That's nothing special. So Crusher put the car back into gear. We'd hardly gone a couple of feet before... The same noise again, as piercing as one of those whistling kettles, and Crummy Dummy struggling like mad. Crusher was getting irritated.
What's the matter with her?
It's just that hill. She's staring at that hill. We all stared through the car windows. Outside was a huge hill, green with pines in places and bare in others, where they'd chopped them down.
Why would she stare at that? Asked Crusher, mystified. It's about as exciting a scene as the test card on telly. One great big boring hill covered in patches of boring pointy pine trees in boring straight rows with boring zigzag cart tracks between them.
"I'll bet that was a nice hill once," said Mum, "before the Forestry Commission got at it and turned it into a matchstick factory." Gree! Bounce, bounce, bounce! A nice quiet ride in the country. Some hopes. "She's trying to tell us something," I said.
What?
"I don't know, do I? But I know she is." We all stared at the hill. Suddenly Mum's eyes began to glaze over.
"It's starting to remind me of something," she said.
"What is?"
"That hill." "That hill?" Crusher was getting really impatient now. "How can a boring old hill covered in spiky little Lego trees with zigzags all over remind you of anything?"
"I don't know," Mum said, "but it does." So we all sat and stared some more. Then Crusher said,
"Me too. That's beginning to remind me of something."
I shook my head. I thought they were both crazy. Until... "Me too! Me too! But don't you see?" I shouted. "Don't you see? It's not something it reminds you of at all. It's someone."
"Someone? I don't understand."
"Look again," I said excitedly. "Look!" They all looked again, except for Crummy Dummy, who hadn't taken her eyes off the hill or stopped screeching and bouncing from the very first moment we drove round the corner and saw it. The hill was round, sort of head-shaped. The little pointy trees stuck all over it looked just like green dyed spikes of hair on a punk's head. The fire breaks looked like zigzag partings. The longer you sat and looked at the hill, the more it looked like someone punk, someone with green hair and zigzag partings. "The thief must look just like that hill," I said. "That's what Crummy Dummy is trying to tell us." She got a good look at him through the cot bars.
"She'd not forget anyone who feeds her chocolate," Crusher said. "Crummy Dummy has a passion for chocolate."
"She shouldn't even know what it tastes like," I scolded. Sometimes I think I'm fighting a losing battle.
"I'm driving straight back into town," Crusher said, "and if I see anyone who looks like that hill over there carrying a telly or a video, he'd better watch out for his ears."
He sounded as if he meant it to. He turned the car around, a neat 9-point turn, and we went back. Crummy Dummy all twisted round in her car seat, screeching loudly in my ears, flapping her arms desperately towards the hill we were leaving behind. Almost as soon as we got back to town, we spotted him, staggering down the great long strip of wasteland beside the ring road. We all guessed it was him straight away, except for Crummy Dummy, who had fallen asleep. He had patches of thick pine-green hair and patches of stubble stuck anyhow all over his head, together with zigzag partings. And he was carrying 2 enormous cardboard boxes, one on top of the other. They must have been terribly heavy. Every few yards he put them down to rest his arms. Crusher pulled up the car, and he and Mum both jumped out. I followed a bit more slowly because I was carrying Crummy Dummy and didn't want to wake her in case she went back to screeching again. Crusher stood right in front of the fellow and tapped the cardboard boxes with his fingers. "What have you got in there, mate?" he asked. "Mind if I take butchers?" The man said something rude. "I shan't repeat it." Crusher Maggot said darkly, "I think that what you've got in there is my video and," pointing at Mum, "this good lady's a television." "Prove it," the man said. "You're on," Crusher said. "The telly has red currant juice smeared all over the screen, and the buttons on the video are sticky with sherbet." "You've never been giving her sherbet," I cried. Now I was really angry. The man looked a bit desperate. "I might have spilled red currant down my own screen," he argued. "And sherbet on your buttons?" Crusher scoffed. The fellow blushed and fell silent. Just then Crummy Dummy woke up. Recognising the man who fed her chocolate, she tried to throw herself out of my arms into his, squealing with pleasure. I very nearly dropped her. "That settles it," said Mum. "She knows who you are." There was a squeal of brakes behind us. The two policemen we met earlier had drawn up at the curb in their car. Mum thought she heard the young one say, "Evening, Boots," as he wound down the window. She was just going to step over and tell him off when Crusher whispered something about his tax disc, and she decided not to bother. "Anything wrong?" the older policeman asked curiously. "I don't think so, thank you very much, officer," Crusher returned politely. "This gentleman here is just helping me load a couple of boxes into my car." He turned to the thief. "Aren't you?" he asked, equally politely. Yes, said the thief hastily. "Yes, I am, sir." The young policeman got out and opened the top box. "You can't last long without a telly, can you?" he said. Then he winked at Mum, got back in the car, and they drove off. Crusher said to the thief, "Hurry up, we'll be missing the snooker." The thief packed the two boxes as neatly as he could into the boot of Crusher's car. "Going our way?" Mum offered, forgetting. "No, he's not," Crusher said, not forgetting. We drove off home in good time for the snooker, in spite of being in third gear. Mum made a special tea, and though the cake was stuffed with colourants and additives, I didn't say a word, not even when they gave some to Crummy Dummy. I reckon she'd earned it. Really I did. Chapter 3. Our Pet. This story is not a pleasant one, but I think that it should be told. Now, those of you with a nervous disposition, that means all the ones who end up face down on the bed sobbing their hearts out after watching something really sad on the telly, should miss this story out. So should the very squeamish. You lot can leave now and join us again at the beginning of the next chapter. The rest can carry on reading, secure in the knowledge that I have asked Mr. Hyam to act as responsibly as possible about the illustrations. Here we go, then. One day we were all sitting in the garden. Well, my half of it. Nobody sane would want to sit in Mum's half. It's a pit. Old cans, bus tickets, empty bottles and torn crisp packets. Bits of old newspapers and one of Crusher's cast-off car tyres. Weeds, stones, two halves of a smashed sink. The whole patch is disgusting. And she's at home all day. You might think, out of the two of us, she'd be the one to find the time to keep her half tidy. You'd be mistaken. My half's quite nice, I think. I have grass in the middle and grow petunias and pansies around my edges. I'm not particularly struck on either flower, but they came up well the first year I tried them, so I've kept on with them. If you sit in my bit and keep your back to the rest, it can be pleasant in the garden, unless the wind is blowing old sweet wrappers across from Mum's side into your face and hair. I could clear her half up, I suppose. I have thought about it. But part of me believes she'll never learn to take responsibility for her own messes if other people are forever picking up after her. She should be forced to face the consequences of her behaviour. She has to learn the hard way that if she doesn't bother to tend her half of the garden, it will become a rubbish dump. And it has. The only problem is, she doesn't seem to notice. "Isn't it nice?" she said, stretching out half on my patch and half on hers. "I love gardens in summer." Her sprawled-out body took up most of my carefully tended pocket-handkerchief lawn, and her head rested comfortably just on the edge of her patch, billowed by Crusher's abandoned car tyre. Crummy Dummy's pram was taking up most of the rest of my half, so Crusher and I squatted rather uncomfortably round the edges. He had his foot on one of my striped petunias, but I couldn't blame him. There was almost no room, unless he wanted to back into Mum's half and take his chances among the old tin cans and bits of broken glass. He was restless, anyhow. He kept stretching up and peering over the gate. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "There's someone coming round to see the car today," said Crusher. "A Mr. Willoughby. I don't want to miss him. I'm hoping he'll buy it." "It doesn't go," I pointed out. "Not since you left the bonnet up through that great thunderstorm. Why should this Mr. Willoughby pay for a car that doesn't go?" "I fixed it," Crusher said. "It goes." "Once round the block," scoffed Mum, "if you're lucky." "He's not expecting a Mercedes-Benz," Crusher said coldly. "He's only paying £70. £70? Mum lifted her head and started peering over the gate as well. "Just think what we could do with £70. And it was because we were all peering over the gate in search of this saviour who was going to bring us £70 that none of us noticed the horrible, mangy, disgusting old dog sneaking through a hole in the hedge behind us and starting to do its business in our garden. I saw it first. I was livid. I ran towards the foul, revolting thing, clapping and shouting and flapping my arms, but it didn't stop. It just kept squatting there, the scruffy, loathsome creature, and carried on till it was quite finished. I lost my temper. "Get out!" I shrieked. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" "Oh, you really can't blame it," Crusher pointed out. "In all fairness, that half of the garden does look like a corporation tip. The poor creature probably believes he's chosen a socially acceptable place to perform." "I think he's sweet," said Mum. "Is he stray?" And she reached out for his scabby, tufty, twisted old neck. He had no collar, of course, and so no tag. "He must be stray," she said. "He's terribly thin." "I hope you're going to wash your hands very thoroughly indeed now," I said to Mum. She wasn't listening. "Can we keep him?" she was asking. "Keep him?" Oh, I was beside myself. "Keep him? That mangy, ancient thing, he ought to be put down." Mum was shocked, I could tell. "Put down?" "Yes, put down." I was furious. "He's absolutely repellent. He's probably crawling with germs and bristling with fleas. He's sure to be carrying all manner of diseases. You can practically see him festering. He's horrible. Horrible." "Wouldn't you like a nice pet?" asked Mum. Sometimes I don't believe she hears a word I say. So then, of course, we ended up in one of those great arguments you get into about pets. I don't need to give you all the details, do I? You've all been through it, haven't you? You've heard it all 1,000,000 times, I'm sure. I started sensibly enough by giving Mum about 100 good reasons why we don't want a pet, and couldn't manage one if we did. And even if we could, this dog would be the worst pet we could get. I know you can work out most of the 100 reasons yourself, but I'll start you off with the first 10. 1, Mum would be bored with him within a week. 2, dogs spread diseases, they are dirty. 3, injections cost the earth. 4, He'd be alone too much in the daytime. 5, we live right by a busy road. 6, we can barely feed us. We can't feed him too. 7, he'd tear up my half of the garden. 8, we couldn't go away on trips. 9, no one has time to walk him every day. 10, no one would want to clear up his mess, etc., etc., etc. I'll walk him every day, said Mum. I'll clear up any mess, promise. Honestly, are you subjected to this sort of rubbish? How can you say that? I practically screamed. How can you? When did you last clear out the goldfish bowl? Look at this garden you were so keen on at the start. Remember the yoga classes? You spent all that money on that orange and pink leotard and stopped going after only 2 weeks. How can you look me in the eye and promise you'll care for this dog as long as he lives? I won't live long, said Crusher. Look at him, he's on his last legs. We all looked at the dog. Crusher was right. He was practically a basket case already, with his great drooping mildew tail and his scraggy body, his chewed-up ears and his pathetic look. Nah, Crusher said, shaking his head gravely. That dog won't live long. We were to remind him of this prediction of his some time later. We were still staring at the dog when the catch on the gate rattled. We all swung round. It was the man who had come round to see Crusher's car. Crusher was all over him in an instant. He was desperate to sell the car. It had been nothing but trouble from the day he bought it. "Come in, Mr. Willoughby," he cried. "No trouble finding us, I hope. Come in and have a cup of coffee." He shepherded Mr. Willoughby into the house. Mum followed them. I looked around. The dog was digging a great hole among my petunias. "Clear off!" I yelled. "Go home! Disappear!" But the old mange ball just curled up in one of Mum's 2 halves of smash sink and fell asleep. I went inside. Crusher was standing in the middle of the kitchen, fussing about the car keys. He couldn't find them, and Mr. Willoughby was beginning to look just a little impatient. "I haven't got very long," he warned. "I had them only a few minutes ago," cried Crusher, mystified. "They were right here in my pocket." Mr. Willoughby glanced at his watch. "They're somewhere here," said Crusher. "They must be." "Can't buy a car without a little test drive," said Mr. Willoughby. Oh, Crusher was desperate. He was whirling about, looking on all the shelves and tabletops, patting his body in search of a telltale bulge. "Minna," he said, "look round the garden, will you, in case I happen to drop them there?" Now, I'll give Crusher Maggot his due. He doesn't order me about much. A lot less than I order him about, anyhow. He doesn't take advantage of the fact that he's grown up and I'm not, and he's with my mum. He doesn't tell me to do things as if he were my own father, which he's not. He doesn't push his luck. So, when he does ask me to do something, I usually try to cooperate. "Just car keys, is it?" I asked. "That's right," said Crusher. "On that plastic key ring, the one that looks like a bone." Looks like a bone. Looks like a bone. "That dog," I said, "was digging a hole in my petunias a few minutes ago." And I went out to have a look. I was right. We found the keys in no time at all. The dog hadn't buried them very far down. Perhaps he got bored. Or maybe he was simply too lazy to bother to dig very deep. But there they were anyway, a couple of inches under the surface, and still attached to the plastic bone key ring. Crusher was delighted. He said to Mr. Willoughby, "I'll start the car up for you, and we'll go for a spin round the estate." "I'll start the car," said Mr. Willoughby. Clearly he was no slouch when it came to buying second-hand cars. "I'll start it," insisted Crusher. Clearly he was no slouch at selling them either. "Backing out into the street's rather tricky." Mr. Willoughby was polite. He looked suspicious, but he didn't press the matter. So that was how it came about that it was Crusher in the driving seat when the car backed out. Mr. Willoughby stood beside Mum and me, watching, as Crusher slid in the car and pulled the safety belt over his shoulders. He switched on the ignition and started the engine. It coughed straight into life. Only Crusher can do it, and not all that often. "Starts well, doesn't it?" Mum said to Mr. Willoughby chattily. Crusher pushed the gear stick into reverse and released the handbrake. He looked in the mirror to check there was no traffic coming down the street, and then checked once again over his shoulder. He let the clutch up a little, and slowly, steadily, the car reversed. Straight over the dog. It had been lying curled up fast asleep behind the back wheel. Now, I'm not going to describe the scene. I know you wouldn't want it. Suffice it to say that for the very first time since I had given it him, Crusher had well and truly lived up to his nickname. Mum always knows exactly what to do in an emergency. She covered her face with her spread hands. "Crusher," she said, "fetch the coal shovel right away. Minna," she said, "run in the house and find one of those nice big plastic rubbish bags for Crusher. Mr. Willoughby," she said, "come in the house with me and finish her coffee." And, keeping her hands firmly over her face, she turned away, and Mr. Willoughby obediently followed. As she strode to the back door, Crusher and I distinctly heard her saying, "Fancy that poor old dog choosing a spot like that to lie down and die so naturally and peacefully in its sleep. We'll just bury it nicely. It won't take a moment, and then you can take the car out again." Mr. Willoughby was clearly too shaken to argue. Crusher wielded the coal shovel like a maniac. He was quite desperate not to lose his sail. Within 3 minutes he had dug a hole at least 2 feet deep. My poor petunias flew off the shovel in clumps. "Why can't you bury the thing in Mum's patch?" I grumbled. "You wait," he consoled me. "This is a natural fertiliser, this is. Next year your pansies will come up like sunflowers. You ought to plant a vine here, really." I wasn't impressed. As soon as Mum saw through the window that we were all cleared up, she ushered Mr. Willoughby outside again, and Crusher ushered him inside the car. He was still dazed. He didn't even seem to notice how long it took him to start up the engine, and if he realised that awful clunking noise was coming from under the bonnet, he didn't say so. In fact, he can't have been himself at all. He bought the car. He counted 5 £10 notes into Crusher's spread hand. "I'm not paying a penny more than 50, he warned. "Done," Crusher agreed. "I'm really far too upset to argue." And Mr. Willoughby drove off in the car. Crusher spun me round and round in his arms. I knew he was ecstatic. Usually he says I'm far too big for that now, and I'll put his back out. "Good old Minna," he cried, "finding those keys, fetching the rubbish bag, letting me bury the dog among your petunias. We're £50 richer today because of your help. Anything you want, Minna, anything, just name it." I thought, there's lots of things I want, but one thing I wanted more than anything else. "Anything, Crusher." "Anything." "Anything at all?" He was adamant. "Anything you want." "Right then," I said, "I want you to clean up that little pile of dog mess straight away." Crusher's all right. He went pale, and he didn't look at all pleased, but he went and did it, straight away. "And all you softies can come back now. It's all over." Chapter 4. You don't look very poorly. You don't exactly ask to get sick, do you? I mean, you don't go round inviting germs and viruses to move in and do their worst to your body. You don't actually apply for trembling legs and feeling shivery and their heads had a miniature steel band practising for a carnival in it all night. And if you should happen to mention to your own mother that you feel absolutely terrible, you would expect a bit of sympathy, wouldn't you? I wouldn't. Not any more. You don't look very poorly. That's what she said, and she said it suspiciously too, as if I was one of those people who's always making excuses to stay off school and spend the day wrapped in a downy on the sofa watching Bagpuss and Play School and Pebble Mill at 1. Well, I feel absolutely rotten. You don't look it. I'm sorry, I snapped. I was getting pretty cross. Sorry I can't manage a bright green face for you, or purple spots on my belly, or all my hair falling out, but I feel rotten just the same. And I burst into tears. Now that's not like me. Now that's not like you, said Mum, sounding sympathetic at last. You must be a little bit off today. I am not off, I snarled through my tears. I'm not leftover milk or rotten fish. There, Mum soothed. Don't fret, Minna. Don't get upset. You just hop straight back up those stairs like a good poppet, and in a minute I'll bring something nice up on a tray, and you can have a quiet day in bed with Mum looking after you till you feel better. That was a bit more like it, as I think you'll agree. So I stopped snivelling and went back to bed. I didn't exactly hop straight back up those stairs because I was feeling so crummy and weak. I could barely drag myself up, hanging onto the banisters. But I got up somehow and put on my dressing gown and buttoned it right up to the top to keep my chest warm, and plumped up my pillow so I could sit comfortably, and switched on my little plastic frog reading lamp, and folded my hands in my lap, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. In case you're wondering, I was waiting for Mum to bring me up something nice on a tray and look after me until I felt better. She never came. Oh, I'm sure that she meant to come. I'm sure she had every intention of coming. I'm sure it wasn't her fault the milkman came and needed paying, and it took time to work out what she owed because he'd been away for 2 weeks on his holiday in Torremolinos. And I'm sure it wasn't Mum's fault that he took the opportunity to park his crate of bottles down on the doorstep and tell her all about the way some sneaky people always bag the best pool loungers by creeping down at dead of night and dropping their swimming towels over them, and how his wife's knees burned and peeled but none of the rest of her, even though all of her was out in the sun for the same amount of time, and how his daughter Meryl came home to her job at the Halifax with a broken heart because of some fellow called Miguel Angel Gapini Lopez de Rego, who danced like a fury but turned out to be engaged to a Spanish girl working in Barcelona. Oh, it wasn't Mum's fault that she had to listen to all that before she could get away to bring me up something nice on a tray and look after me until I was better. But I could hear them talking clearly enough on the doorstep, and I don't actually recall hearing her say firmly but politely, "Excuse me, Mr. Hooper, but Minna's in bed feeling terrible, and I must get back upstairs, so I'll listen to all the rest tomorrow." I heard quite a bit, but I didn't hear that. As soon as the milkman had chinked off next door, I thought I heard Mum making for the bottom of the stairs, but she never got there. You guessed it, Crummy Dummy woke up. And I suppose it wasn't Mum's fault that Crummy Dummy needed her nappy changing, and that there weren't any dry ones because we don't have a tumble dryer, and it had been raining for 3 solid days. And Crusher Maggot had forgotten to pick up a packet of disposable nappies before he went off to Sheffield for a few days to help the sister of a mate change flats. So Mum decided the simplest thing would be to park Crummy Dummy in the playpen, where little accidents don't matter. It wasn't her fault it took forever to drag it out of the cupboard, because Crusher had dumped some great heavy lump of car innards right in front of it, or that she had to fetch the damp nappies off the line and drape them over the rack in the kitchen. And I suppose it's understandable that while she was shaking out the damp nappies, she should glance out of the window at the grey skies and think about nipping down to the laundrette with the rest of the washing and handing it to Mrs. Hargee to do in the machine, since it really didn't look as if it would ever stop raining. So I suppose it does make sense that the very next thing I heard on my quiet day in bed was Mum bellowing up the stairs, "Minna! Minna! Look after the baby for a few minutes, will you, while I nip down to the laundrette? She's perfectly happy in her playpen with her toys. Just come down if she starts to squawk." Fine, lovely, sure. Here am I, feeling really terrible and looking forward to something nice on a tray and being looked after until I feel better. And suddenly I'm looking after the baby. Fine, lovely, sure. To be quite fair to Mum, she didn't stay out any longer than was absolutely necessary. There was the laundrette, of course, and then she had to get the disposable nappies, or Crummy Dummy would have had to spend the whole morning sitting on her cold bottom in the playpen, waiting for the ones in the kitchen to dry. And while she was in the supermarket, she did pick up bread and a quarter of sliced ham and a few oranges and a couple of other things, making too many to get through the quick checkout. And there were really long queues at all the others because it was pension day morning. And she did just pop into the newsagent's on her way home as well. And yes, she did stop on the corner for a second, but that was just to be polite to the lollipop lady, who told her that whatever it was I'd got, there was a lot of it about, and Mum ought to be really careful or she'd come down with it as well. And then she came straight home. She says she was out for no more than 5 minutes at the very most, but I've a watch, so I know better. Then, at last, she came up to my room. She had Crummy Dummy tucked under one arm, all bare bottom and wriggles, and she was carrying a tray really high in the air, practically above her head, so Crummy Dummy couldn't upset it with all her flailing arms and legs. It was so high I couldn't see what was on it from the bed. "I don't know how these nurses do it," said Mum. "They should have medals pinned on their chests, not watches." I looked at mine. It was exactly 10:30. I fell sick at 8:23. "If you were a nurse," I said, "you would have got the sack 2 hours ago." "I'd like to see you do any better," she snapped back sharpish. "I bet I would," I told her. "I bet if you were sick, it wouldn't take me 2 whole hours to bring you something nice on a tray." "I should wait till you see what there is on the tray before you start grumbling," Mum warned. And then she lowered it onto the bed in front of me. And there was a cup of very milky coffee with bubbles on top in my favourite fat china bear mug, and a huge orange cut into the thinnest possible circular slices, just how I like it when I want to nibble at the peel as well, and a chocolate biscuit bar, and the latest Beano and Dandy, and a pack of 20 brand new fine-tipped felt pens. I felt dead guilty for being so grumpy. "I'm sorry I said you'd get the sack as a nurse." "Oh, that's all right," Mum answered cheerfully. She flipped Crummy Dummy over and put a nappy on her before there was trouble and even more laundry. "It's a well-known fact that it's even harder to be a good patient than a good nurse." "Is that true?" "Certainly." And then, with Crummy Dummy safe at last, Mum sat down on my bed and took a break. I thought about what she said quite a lot while I was getting better. As I sipped my coffee and nibbled my orange circles and read my Beano and made my chocolate biscuit last as long as I could while I was drawing with my brand new felt pens, I wondered what sort of patient Mum would make. She isn't famous in this house for long-suffering meekness or sunny patience. And I wondered what sort of nurse I'd make. Sensitive, deft, unflappable, efficient. I'd no idea I would find out so soon. It was only 2 days later, on Saturday morning, that Mum leaned over the banisters and called down, "Minna, I feel just awful. Awful." "You don't look very poorly." "No, I didn't mean it that way. It just popped out. You'd have thought I was trying to suggest she was faking." "I may not look it, but I am," she snapped. "I feel as if I've been left out all night in the rain, and my bones have gone soggy, and hundreds of spiteful little men with steel boots are holding a stamping competition in my brain." Personally, even without the lollipop lady saying there was a lot of it about, I would have recognised the symptoms at once. I was determined to show Mum what proper nursing ought to be. "You go straight back to bed," I ordered. "I'll take care of you and everything else. You tuck yourself in comfortably, and I'll bring up something nice on a tray." Mum swayed a little against the banisters. She did look pale. "Oh, you are an angel, Minna," she said faintly, and wrapping her shiny black skull and crossbones dressing gown more closely round her string vest nightie, she staggered back into the bedroom. I don't have to tell you about my plan, do I? You'll already have guessed. Yes, I was going to rush back into the kitchen and spread a tray with lovely, tempting treats for an invalid's breakfast. Treats like a cup of tea made just the way Mum really likes it, golden pale, not that thick, murky, dark sludge favoured by Crusher. He says Mum's tea is too weak to crawl out of the pot. And I was going to pick a tiny posy of flowers from my half of the garden and arrange them in one of the pretty china egg cups. And I was going to bring the tray up without delay. Guess what went wrong first? No, don't bother, I'll tell you. First, I locked myself out. Honestly, me, Minna, the only one in the house who never does it. I did it. I was so keen to get my tray arranged that I stepped out of the back door into the garden to find the flowers without checking the latch. Clunk. The moment I heard the door close behind me, I realised I could have kicked myself in the shins. I picked my way around to the front, just on the off chance that the front door was unlocked. But I knew it wouldn't be, and of course it wasn't. I stood there thinking. I had two choices. I could ring the doorbell and drag poor, shaking, deathly pale Mum from her bed of sickness and down the stairs to let me in. Or I could slip next door to old Mrs. Pitopoulos, ring her bell instead, and ask to borrow the spare key to our house she keeps for emergencies in an old cocoa tin under her sink. I knew which a good nurse would do. I went next door and rang the bell. No answer. I rang again. Still no answer. Suddenly, I noticed a faint scrabbling overhead. I looked up, and there was Mrs. Pitopoulos in her quilted dressing gown, fighting the stiff window catch with her arthritic fingers. She couldn't budge it, so she just beckoned me inside the house. I tried the front door. It was locked. I went round the back, and that door opened. I picked my way through the furry sea of all her pet cats rubbing their arched backs against my legs, so pleased to see me, and went upstairs. Mrs. Pitopoulos was sitting on the edge of her bed. Her face looked like a wrinkled sack, and her wig was all crooked. "You look very poorly," I told her. I couldn't help it, it just popped out. "Oh, Minna," she said, "I feel terrible, terrible. My legs are rubber, and there are red-hot nails in my head." "I've had that," I said. "Mum's got it now. The lollipop lady says that there's lots of it about." When she heard this, Mrs. Pitopoulos began to look distinctly better. Maybe when you're that age and you get sick, you think whatever it is has come to get you. At any rate, she tugged her wig round on her head, and even the wrinkles seemed to flatten out a bit. "Minna," she said, "would you do me a great favour and feed my hungry cats?" "What about you?" I said. "Have you had anything this morning?" "Oh, I'm not hungry," Mrs. Potopoulos declared. But then she cocked her head on one side and wondered about it. And then she added, "Maybe I do feel just a little peckish. Yesterday my sister brought me all these lovely things, new-laid brown speckled eggs and homemade bread and a tiny pot of fresh strawberry jam. But what I'd really like is—" Her eyes were gleaming, and she looked miles better. "What I'd really like is a bowl of Heinz tomato soup with bits of white bread floating on the top." "Even I can cook that." And so I did, and fed her cats. And she was so pleased when I brought the soup up to her on a tray that she pressed on me all the little gifts her sister had brought round the day before, the new-laid brown speckled eggs, and homemade bread, and tiny pot of fresh strawberry jam. Oh, and the door key, of course. Mum was astonished when I brought the tray up. I thought she must have been asleep. She looked as if she'd been dozing. She heaved herself upright against the pillows, and I laid the tray down on her knees. "Minna," she cried, "oh, how lovely! Look at the flowers." You'd think someone who claims to like flowers so much would take a little bit more care with her half of the garden, wouldn't you? "Wait till you've tasted the food," I said. I could tell that she didn't really feel much like eating, but she was determined not to hurt my feelings, so she reached out and took one of the strips of hot buttered toast made from the homemade bread. She nibbled the crust politely. "Delicious," she said, and then, delicious." She couldn't help dipping the next strip of toast into the new-laid brown speckled soft-boiled egg. She cried, "this is wonderful." After the egg was eaten, she still had 2 strips of toast left. She spread one with the fresh strawberry jam, and off she went again. Marvellous! She went into raptures over the golden pale tea. I reckoned poor old Crusher would have a battle getting her back onto the thick, murky, dark sludge when he came home. And then she leaned back against the pillows, smiling. She looked a lot better. "I'll bring you some more if you'd like it," I offered. "You are the very best nurse," Mum declared. "You managed all this, and so quickly too." Now I was sure she'd been dozing. I'd taken ages. "You're the very best patient," I returned the compliment. "You don't notice what's going on or how long it takes." "Silly," she said, and snuggled back under the bed covers. I think she must have thought I was joking. Chapter 5. Crusher Maggot's Stately Home. Early one Saturday morning, some old man we'd never even seen before came round to our house asking for Mr. Pollard. Mum answered the door in her nightie. I wish she wouldn't. "Who?" she asked, slouching against the door frame. "Mr. Pollard," repeated the old man. "A Mr. Harold Pollard?" "I've never heard of him," Mum said. "He certainly doesn't live here." "Sure?" "Certain," said Mum.
"Pity."
The old man shrugged, lifting the carrier bag in his hand. He added,
"Because this is definitely the address he wrote on the stub of the ticket that won this bottle of whiskey in the pub raffle."
"Oh!" Mum clapped her hand over her mouth. "Harold Pollard, of course! Yes, this is the right house." She put out her hand to take the whiskey, But the old man had turned away. "Don't try that one on me," he called back over his shoulder. "I might be old, but I'm not senile. It's only 5 seconds since you were telling me you'd never heard of Harold Pollard." "Oh, I have, though," Mum insisted. "It's just that, for the moment, I completely forgot whose name it is." But the old man was already halfway down the path, clutching the carrier bag to his chest and mumbling crossly to himself about the dishonesty of some people round here. Mum turned on me. She was ratty. "Now that's your fault." She stamped her foot. "Who was it went and called him Crusher Maggot so often that I forgot his real name? I blame you for this, Minna." "He's your boyfriend, not mine," I defended myself. "You ought to remember his name. He'll blame you." He did too. He went pale as a maggot after he heard the terrible news, and went on all the rest of the morning about how he must have spent thousands of pounds on raffle tickets in his time, and never won so much as a stuffed furry monkey. And now that he'd finally won a whole bottle of whiskey, Mum had as good as poured it down the sink. And then, 5 minutes before opening time, he prized his winning raffle ticket out of his skin-tight leather cut-offs and strode off down the pub in search of his prize. He came back a little later in a slightly better temper, clutching the bottle of whiskey. "That old man had no time to drink much of it," he told us, "not more than a couple of swigs anyhow." I left the room. I was disgusted. Sometimes I think I am the only person in our household who actually believes in germs. When I came back, Crusher was telling my mum off. "You ought to be ashamed," he was saying, "not remembering the name of your own boyfriend. You ought to take a proper interest." Mum scowled. "I do." I can't say that she sounded very convincing. "All right," Crusher Maggot challenged her. "I'll test you. How many brothers do I have?" Mum wasn't sure. "How many sisters?" Mum wasn't sure about that either. "Where was I born?" Mum knew the answer to that, of course, because he's got it tattooed on his head. "Made in Birmingham." But then Crusher claimed that question didn't count and asked another. "Where was I brought up?" Mum didn't know. "See?" Crusher triumphed. "You really don't know the first thing about me." "Gran's always saying that," I reminded them both. Neither looked pleased. "Oh, right," Mum said. "You win. I don't know much about you. So instead of sitting there crowing about it, why don't you just tell me?" "I'll go one better than that," claimed Crusher. "I'll show you." And he went off to have a go at his new car. "Where is he planning on taking us?" I asked. "How should I know?" snapped Mum. "It's Crusher Maggot I know, not Harold Pollard." I must say I came to see what she meant as the day passed. We didn't go in Crusher's new car. It wouldn't start. So Crusher swung Crummy Dummy up on his shoulders, and we strolled up to our end of the bypass to catch a bus. "Where are we going? Town or country?" I asked Crusher. You can never tell which way people at the bus stop are heading, since it's just before the roundabout. "Country," said Crusher, "just outside a small village." "Oh-ho!" cried Mum. "Pigpen Pollard, here we come." You could tell she was still in a really bad mood. The bus took forever to turn up, and when it did, I wished it hadn't. "Spindle Village, please," Crusher said to the driver. The driver looked us up and down. 270s and 135, he said at last. "Babies are free." Mum pointed at me. "She's free too," she said. I was appalled, simply appalled. I haven't been free on the buses for years. While Crusher fed £1.40 into the ticket machine, the driver peered at me above his spectacles. "How old is she?" he asked suspiciously. Even Mum couldn't bring herself to say 5. She just muttered something about me being rather big for my age and poked me in the back. "Aren't you, Minna?" No, I said, no, I'm not. I'm not at all big for my age. I'm quite normal. And children my age pay half on buses. And I started to dig in my pockets for 35p. I'm going to let you off the fare, the driver said to me, because you're honest. Unlike some people, he added under his breath, as Mum moved past him down the bus. Good job it was practically empty, or I'd have died. All the way to Spindle, I questioned Crusher closely about the house he was brought up in. How many rooms does it have? 208, not counting cellars. How many chimney pots? Hundreds. How big is the garden? What, in acres? I'm not quite sure about acres, so I said, compared with that playground where Crummy Dummy likes the duck swings. Let me see, Crusher was thinking, about 100 times bigger. I grinned. I could keep going as long as he could. How far is it from the front gate to the front door? About 3/4 of a mile. I thought he was joking. Until the bus stopped just before Spindle Village, and we got off outside the largest pair of wrought iron gates I've ever seen in my life. They towered over me, and I'm no midget, I can tell you. Only my mother could look at me and still try to get me a free ride on a bus. Here we are. Here? Yep. Is this it? It certainly is. I don't believe you. But Crusher couldn't have been kidding, because he walked straight up to the stone wall that fringed the huge, high, curvy gates, and carefully prized a little slab of stone out from where it was sitting, neat and unnoticed among all the others. Behind it, hidden in the old wall, was a key. No one who hadn't known it was there could ever have found it. Come on, then, he said, unlocking the padlock that held the gates closed. Let's go and meet my dad. I must say I felt a bit nervous about meeting Harold's father, if this was where he lived. I wish we could turn back and forget it. I didn't think we looked right. I thought that Crusher should have warned us earlier, because Mum was wearing her sequin bikini top with the gold tassels and her baggy pink-spotted bloomer trousers, and she had spent the boring bus ride brushing up Crummy Dummy's hair into fresh spikes. She looked just like a circus clown with a punk baby. Mind you, Crusher looked just as outlandish with his enormous rainbow Mohican and chains all over, and one of his black skin-tight leather trouser legs cut off a good half-metre above the other. But he's not my mother or my baby sister. Crusher swung Crummy Dummy back on his shoulders, and we set off along the wooded drive. It was cool and dark, like an airy green tunnel, and so quiet you could hear the birds flap away as we walked round each lazy curve. The flickering specks of light between the trees grew larger and fiercer, till suddenly we stepped out on a stretch of road heaped high on either side with glorious red bushes. Rhododendrons, said Crusher. I'm glad he told us. I was quite interested to see a rhododendron. Gran says she was always having to spell them at school. And then, coming round the last bend, we saw the house. Mum and I stopped to stare. It was the most enormous mansion, with rows and rows and rows of windows standing behind a huge green lawn. I've never seen a lawn that big before. Miles and miles of flat, unbroken green, and not a speck of litter. Not one. Our old headmaster would have burst into tears if he'd seen it. We weren't alone, though. Standing right on the edge of the lawn was someone peering closely into a flower bed. The sun sailed behind a sliver of cloud, and he lifted his head. Spotting Crusher, who had moved out of the shadows, he suddenly started walking towards us. He looked dead posh. I felt quite frightened. Mum did too, I think. At least, she hung back out of sight with me among the rhododendrons. But Crusher kept on striding forward, with Crummy Dummy on his shoulders, getting closer and closer to the man who was walking towards him. To throw him out, I thought, until I heard him booming across the lawn.
Good Lord, is that young Harry Pollard? Fancy your rolling home like this out of the blue.
The man stopped and took a proper look at Crusher.
Still stamping around looking like an Apache, I see.
Gran says the same quite often, but whereas Gran says it rather rudely, I always think, this man clearly didn't mean a thing by it. He was just being friendly.
Fine baby you've got there, Harry,
he added admiringly as he came close.
Chip off the old block.
Crusher gave him a big wide grin and let go of one of Crummy Dummy's ankles to wave a hand about expansively. Crummy Dummy toppled sideways. I rushed out of the shadows. To do her credit, so did Mum. The posh man stared. He did try not to, you could tell, but he just couldn't help it. Perhaps he was used to young Harry Pollard turning up looking like an Apache. He could even handle one little look-alike Apache baby. But he couldn't quite manage Mum, with her sequined bikini top with gold tassels and her baggy pink spotted bloomer trousers. He swallowed a bit. Then, "How do you do, madam?" he asked Mum, offering her his hand to shake. "A lovely day. Most clement. He seemed to want to get safely onto the weather, I thought. "Smashing," said Mum. "No rain at all." The man shook his head sadly. "A poor lookout for the crops, though." Mum stared. She'd got no sympathy for farmers, my Mum. Like Gran, she reckons they all make sure they do all right for themselves. Whenever the newsreaders on the telly look serious and mention the farmers, my Mum's lips curl and she sings the chorus to that song. "Oh, I've never seen a farmer on a bike. No, I've never seen a farmer on a bike." She didn't even hum it this time, though. She just kept quiet. Then the man noticed me hiding behind Mum. He held out his hand. I wiped mine and shook it.
"And this young lady?"
I took a deep breath. "Your rhododendrons are quite lovely," I told him.
"Thank you," he replied. "Thank you so much. I am rather proud of my rhododendrons."
And then you could just tell he'd had enough of us and wanted to get back to his flower beds. His eyes glazed over.
"I'll let you all get on now, shall I?"
he murmured. Then turning to Crusher,
"You don't happen to be going along by the greenhouses, do you, Harry?"
"Well," Crusher looked doubtful.
"I was just going to pop inside and see my dad." Of course.
The man tried not to look too disappointed.
"Naturally. So you'd better go straight in by the front." "Righty-ho," Crusher said. "Sir."
I've only ever heard Crusher say so once before, and that was to the policeman who stopped him after his exhaust pipe fell off and was wondering whether to bother to charge him.
"Lovely to see you," the man said. "Mustn't leave it so long next time."
He smiled politely and shook hands with everyone all over again, even with Crummy Dummy on top of Crusher's shoulders. She chortled away. When he reached up and shook her fingers, she was delighted. "He was nice," Mum said as we traipsed over the lawn towards the mansion. "Who was he, then?"
"Lord Harbinger," said Crusher. "He's all right, he is, not a bad stick."
Mum fell silent at that. She was thinking. So was I. If she was thinking what I was thinking, it was this. If Crusher's home was so incredibly posh that even the man who looked after the flower beds had a title, then who might we meet behind the front door? Viscount Pollard? The Marquis of Spindle? Even King Harold? Maybe my mum's boyfriend was actually a prince in disguise. It didn't seem likely. I peered at Crusher Maggot sideways. No, it didn't seem likely. But you never know. And if his dad lived in this house... You've never seen a front door like it. I bet you they nicked it off a cathedral. It was so large, it had whole doors set into it in case you couldn't be bothered to open the entire thing. It was so enormous, it made me feel small enough to go free on the buses. But Crusher just walked straight on up to it as though it were any old front door, and laid his hand on one of the great brass bell pulls. Mum got even more nervous. "Are you sure this is right?" she asked, reaching up to lift Crummy Dummy off Crusher's shoulders. "I lived here, didn't I?" Crusher said haughtily. "I ought to know." And he tugged at the great brass bell pull. From deep inside the mansion we heard the low, throaty jangle of a far-off echoing bell. I'm sorry to turn all poetic, but that's the sort of noise it was. A minute passed, and then another. I thought I could hear footsteps, but I was just imagining it. I got more and more apprehensive, and so did Mum. But Crusher just stood there muttering about not having all day and the time of the last bus home and his father pretending he had rheumatism. Suddenly I did hear something. A heavy, grinding noise, like someone pulling back a rusty bolt, and then metallic clinks and rattlings as if a huge key were being pushed inside a lock and turned. Then a creak, then a squeaking. And then there was a sudden rush of cold air, and standing in front of us, blinking at the daylight he had let in on himself, was a man in a black uniform with gold braid on his sleeves and gold buttons and a black cap with gold along its peak. "Harold!" the man cried. "Dad!" shouted Crusher. They fell into each other's arms. They hugged each other, they patted one another's backs, they stroked each other's hair, they clapped one another on the shoulders. What a surprise! "Good to see you, Dad." "You should have said." "Spur of the moment, Dad." "I could have bought cake." Then the old man noticed the rest of us. First he saw Mum, so he stopped patting Crusher. "Pleased to meet you," he told her, though he looked just a little bit doubtful. Mum smiled. I think she was simply glad that Crusher's dad hadn't turned out to be even posher than Lord Harbinger. But it came out as one of her radiant, winning sunshine smiles, the kind she turns on our headmaster when she's missed 4 PTA meetings in a row, and Crusher's dad was lost at once. Then he saw Crummy Dummy, and tears welled in his eyes. You could tell straight away he was one of those grandpa-style softies. "Is this your baby, lad?" he asked, his voice choked up so fast he could barely speak. "Sort of," said Crusher. The old man reached out. Crummy Dummy's not so daft. She knows when she's onto a good thing. Squealing with joy, she threw herself into his arms. She likes older people. They remind her of Gran. The old man patted her on her wet nappy and turned to me. "And this young lady?" he inquired. "This is Minna," said Crusher. "She tries to keep me and her mum in order." "I'm pleased to meet you," Crusher's father said. "And certainly in respect of Harold here, I hope your efforts are crowned with more conspicuous success than my own." "What?" Crusher said, all suspicious. I got it, though. We all trooped through the door, along one corridor and then another, round a few corners, down a passage or two. Through the odd half-open doorway I caught quick glimpses of the most fabulous rooms, rich with rhododendron-coloured drapes and patterned rugs, all chock-a-block with polished tables and precious china and bowls of flowers. Then we followed Crusher's father down a short flight of steps and then another, along one more corridor, round one last corner, and into Crusher's dad's part of the mansion. No wonder it took him so long to answer the door. There wasn't anything worth having for tea, and even if there had been, I bet he wouldn't have been able to find it. He seemed in a real dither, what with making sure everyone had a comfortable chair and checking he'd got all our names off pat and telling Mum and me about his job. Oh, yes, he claimed over his cup of tea. It's a very good position, doorman to Lord Harbinger. It suited me for 25 years. It'll suit me until I turn up my toes. But we couldn't stay that long. Crusher kept saying we ought to be making our way back to the bus stop, or we'd be stranded overnight. Mr. Pollard turned all wistful when he realised we were really going and taking Crummy Dummy with us. Those two had really taken a shine to one another. She'd spent the afternoon on his lap, practically purring, while he made a point of referring to her as Miranda and brushing her hair spikes down with the palm of his hand. "You must come and see us," Mum consoled him at the door. "You're Crusher's family, so you're always welcome." "Right." Crusher tried to tempt his dad. "I won a bottle of whiskey in a raffle today. You come and visit us and we'll drink it." And Crummy Dummy blew him a lovely farewell bubble. We walked back over the wide green lawns. Lord Harbinger nodded at us politely as we passed by the flower bed. He gave a special wave to Crummy Dummy and looked quite disappointed to see her hair all soft and flat. Mum coughed up my half-fare on the bus without arguing. I was glad about that. It had been a long day. Chapter 6. All Right. Meeting Crusher's old father that day set me off wondering about my own dad. It's not as if I've ever seen that much of him. In fact, there were times I could barely recall what he looked like. I knew he worked in a big garage about 150 miles down the motorway, but whenever I asked Mum anything more about him, she only said, "Oh, he's all right." It isn't much to build on, is it? Well, is he good-looking? He looks all right. Is he intelligent? His brain works all right. Is he amusing? Oh, made me laugh all right, I suppose. Is he kind? Oh, he was always all right with me and the cats. I lost my temper then. If he was never any better than all right, I snapped, why did you bother to have me? Mum laughed and stretched out her hand to stroke my hair. "Oh, you," she said. "You're all right too, you are." You see? Hopeless, absolutely hopeless. So I gave up. But then, a few days later in school, we started something new, a project on families. Mr. Russell told everyone to be quiet, and then he tossed up to see whether we were to start with mothers or fathers. And fathers won, so fathers it was. "I haven't got one," Andrew said. "Neither have I. Oh, mine's in Australia. Lucky you." Then Mr. Russell told everyone to be quiet again. "If you haven't got your own real, original, biological father," he said, "pick out the person who comes closest. Pick someone—" He paused and waved his hands around in the air, searching for an example. "Pick someone you would ask to fix your bike." "I haven't got a bike," said Joel. "My mum always fixes my bike," said Sarah. "I asked my dad to fix my bike," grumbled Arif. "6 weeks ago. He hasn't even looked at it yet." He scowled and added with real bitterness, "And he's my own real original biological dad. My uncle fixes my bike. He's got a bike shop. Nothing's ever gone wrong with my bike." "I've never even had a bike," Joel said sadly. "At least you've got a father," said Andrew. Joel was just telling us he thought he'd much prefer a bike when Mr. Russell told everyone to be quiet again. "Father," he said, "or someone like it. I want a picture or a photograph and 2 whole sides of writing by Friday." We all groaned loudly, and by the time Mr. Russell had told everyone to be quiet again, the bell had rung. I ran off home. Mum was leaning against the draining board. She was wearing her plum-coloured plastic boots and her fishnet stockings. She was fiddling with her tarantula earrings. Crusher Maggot was slouching at the kitchen table, wearing funny dark glasses and playing a tune on his skull with his knuckles. What do they do all day long when I'm away at school? That's what I'd like to know. I asked Mum, "Do you have a photo of my real dad?" "Yes," she said. "No, I dunno. No, yes." I do try to be very patient. "Which?" I said. "Yes or no?" "Both, really," she replied. "I do have a photo of him, yes, but I'm afraid that my left elbow got in front of most of his face, and what little of him is showing's terribly blurry. You'd never know that it was him." "Weren't there any other photos?" Mum tipped her head on one side to think. One of the tarantula earrings crawled over her cheek and the other got tangled in her hair. It was very off-putting. "There were some others," she recalled, "but you were in them too, so he took those with him." I thought that was a little daft myself. One of them might have realised I would grow up and want to see them. But, still as patient as could be, I asked, "Where is this famous photo of part of his blurred face and your left elbow?" "I'm not sure," Mum said. "I think I've lost it." I simply can't think why they call it homework. I'd stand a better chance of getting it done on the moon. "I need a photo," I told her, "to take to school." "Take that nice one of Crusher," she told me. I've mentioned this photograph of Crusher before, I think. Do you remember? It's the one with his hair in flaming red and orange spikes, and his teeth ferociously bared, and his tattoo showing. "No, thank you," I answered as politely as possible. "I'd like one of my own real original biological father." "All right," said Crusher, "suit yourself. I'll ask him for one next time I see him." I turned and stared. "See him?" I said. "Do you get to see him?" "Quite often," Crusher said. "I always fill up with petrol at his garage. Why, I stopped in and had a couple of words with him only a week ago." I was amazed, simply amazed. "How is he?" I asked. "How is my very own real original biological father?" Crusher wasn't at all irritated by this display of crippling sarcasm. "All right," he said. "He was all right." But Mum was a little put out by my rudeness. "Original and biological he may be," she said, "but who fixes your bike?" I'd really like to know where they pick up all this fix-your-bike business. I was still angry. "Next time," I said, as cold as ice, "next time that someone drops in to have a few words with my own real original biological father, do you think they might possibly bother to mention it to me?" "I'll do better than that," Crusher offered. "I'll take you down there." "When?" "When you like." I thought about it. "I need the photo before Friday," I told him. "Tomorrow, then." "All right," I said. "Tomorrow. Oh, right. So that's how it came about that the very next day I borrowed next door's fancy new camera, and Crusher borrowed the other side's car since his own still wasn't going, and I travelled with him all the way down the motorway. It meant I had to take the whole afternoon off school. Mum said it didn't matter since I'd be doing school work and taking the photo, but I didn't dare tell that one to Mr. Russell. That sort of thinking really annoys him. He calls it slack. I did consider trying to explain, but he was in one of his terribly busy moods, and in the end I just did what everyone else in the class does and told him that I had to go to the dentist. It took Crusher and me exactly 2 hours and 40 minutes to drive down the motorway as far as the garage. It was a big one, set back a little from the road. There were several lines of pumps, and every one of them was busy with people filling cars and motorbikes. Crusher pulled up beside the air and water. "Tell you what," he suggested, picking next door's fancy new camera off the back seat and thrusting it into my hands. "I'll give you over to your own real original biological dad, and then I'll nip off for a while and do what I was going to do." "What were you going to do?" I asked, suddenly suspicious. First Crusher looked blank, then a little bit shifty. "I really haven't the time to stop and explain," he told me. I gave him a look, one of my searching looks. "You drove all the way down here just to bring me to see my dad, didn't you?" I accused him. "No, I didn't," said Crusher. "Oh, yes, you did." "No, I didn't." "You did, I can tell." "All right," said Crusher, embarrassed. "All right, maybe I did, but I certainly didn't drive all this way just to sit in the front seat of the car arguing with you." And he got out. I followed. Crusher was looking round the garage forecourt. Suddenly he nudged my elbow. "There," he said, nodding towards a man in overalls who was bending over a pile of cut-price tyres. "There he is." "Really?" "Yes, that's him." And Crusher bellowed across the crowded forecourt. "Hi, Bill! Bill! Here's your young Minna come to see ya." The man in overalls lifted his head and stared in our direction. I say our direction, but it was only my direction by then, because Crusher Maggot had disappeared in a flash after making his announcement, and I was left standing alone on the petrol station forecourt, clutching a camera, and 10 yards from my own real, original biological father I hadn't seen for ages. It was all right. In fact, he was jolly nice, really. He gave me tons of comics and free bars of chocolate from the garage shop, and a brand new film for the people next door to make up for my borrowing their camera. He helped me take a lot of photos, and even showed me how to set the time release button so we could get some of us standing together with his arm round my shoulders. He made me promise to send him copies of all the ones that came out properly, and he laughed like a drain when I told him about the only photo of him that Mum has left. He asked quite a lot of questions about our family, and he seemed pretty interested when I told him all about Crummy Dummy. He said he was glad to hear I had company now, and he made me promise to send a photo of her too, and a good one of Mum. He asked me about school and my friends and the house. He said that he was very pleased to hear I could swim, and he sounded interested in my roller skating. Then he left someone else looking after the forecourt and took me for a spin up the motorway in one of the open sports cars parked round the back of the garage. That was fantastic! The wind blew my hair till it stuck out like Mum's. He said I looked a bit like Mum anyway. He drove miles faster than Crusher Maggot does, and when I told him so, he grinned and said that he was glad to hear it. I didn't know quite what to call him. I tried to say the word Dad once or twice, but it sort of got stuck because I didn't know him well enough yet. Then he said, "Why don't you just call me Bill? Everyone else does." And that was easier. When we drove back towards the garage, I could see Crusher standing waiting on the forecourt. Bill slowed the car right down, and just before we came close enough for Crusher to overhear, he asked me privately, "Do you get on with him? Is he all right?" I looked at Crusher, who was watching me anxiously to see how I was getting on with my own real, original, biological father. "Yes," I said, "he's all right." "Good," Bill said. "Good." So that was that, really. The three of us shared a quick cup of tea out of the machine, and I ate one more chocolate bar and took one more for the journey. Bill insisted on filling the car up for nothing. "It's not every day my daughter comes down to visit me," he said. Then Crusher and I got in and drove off. I waved, and Bill waved and shouted that he'd pop in next time he came up our way, and I was to give his best wishes to Mum. Then we were out of sight. Crusher settled himself more comfortably in the seat then. "Well?" "All right," I told him. He was all right. When we got home it was dark. Mum was really pleased to see us. All of the photos came out fine. Some were really good. I've got the best ones pinned on my bedroom wall now. I even managed the 2 whole pages of writing about my own real, original, biological father, though I could tell that Mr. Russell was really disappointed that I'd chosen to do him instead of Crusher Maggot, whom he's seen hanging around for me at the school gates. And now, as you can see, I'm in the habit too. Yesterday, when Arif and I were sitting on the curbside watching poor Crusher trying to fix our bikes, Arif asked me what my real father was like, and without even thinking, I answered, "Oh, he's all right." Sometimes I worry that I'm getting just like all the rest of them, honestly I do. Chapter 7. Elk Money. I've never been in trouble at school before. And mind you, even this time it wasn't really my fault. It was my mum's. I may have mentioned to you before that when it comes to getting me to school every day, and on time, my mum could do better. It's really up to me. If I didn't watch out for myself, I'd never get through the gates in the morning before the bell rings, and if I did, I'd have the world's worst bags under my eyes. You're going to find it a little hard to believe, but this is how bedtime generally goes in our house. Me: "I really think I ought to be going up to bed now." Mum: astonished: "Why?" Me: patiently: "Because it's getting rather late." Mum: "It's not that late." Me, looking at my watch: "It's well past my bedtime." Mum: "Oh, you're getting older all the time. You don't need that much sleep." Me: "I do. Look at me. I've already got great big grey bags under my eyes." Mum: "That's just the light." Me: "No, it isn't." Mum: "Well, what about this board game? Surely you can stay up just long enough to finish the game. It's nearly over." Me: "It's nowhere near over. It'll take ages." Mum, sulking: "Oh, well, suit yourself." Me, firmly: "Mum, I need my sleep." Mum: "Oh, all right, go on then. I'll come up in a little while and tuck you in." Me, really relieved: "Oh, good, Mum. Thanks." See? It's ridiculous. It's the same battle every single night. I just can't stand it. And often I turn up at school the next morning, yawning with real grey-blue shadows under my eyes. And don't think Mr. Russell doesn't notice. Then one day I was really late. And that wasn't my fault either. It was Mum's. It happened on Tuesday. Tuesday's the day we're all supposed to bring in our elk money. It isn't much, it's only 10p each, but it's important because our class is sponsoring this elk. All the schools in our district were sent these letters from the local zoo begging for sponsors. Mr. Russell is very democratic by nature, so our class got to vote for what we wanted. We argued for weeks, and in the end we voted to ask for a gorilla. But we had taken so long discussing the matter democratically that elks were all the zoo had left by then. Miss Macpherson across the corridor isn't a bit democratic by nature. She just chose any old animal herself and wrote back the same day. She chose the gorilla and her class got it. Henry Boot overheard Mr. Russell muttering something in the corridor about simple dictatorship being a very easy matter. But Miss Macpherson snapped back at him pretty sharpish about the limits of democracy and was cross enough not to share her gorilla. So our class has this elk. Her name is Elsie, and she eats a lot. "Keep those 10p rolling into school," pleads Mr. Russell. I think he worries that if enough of us forget to shell out, then he will have to make up the amount himself. We all know exactly how poor he is because they're always telling you about teachers' pay on the telly. So we all try very hard to remember our elk money every Tuesday, and Mr. Russell gets quite testy if we forget. And I forgot. Well, I didn't forget. I remembered only too well. It was just that I hadn't any money of my own, and Mum refused to lend me any of hers. It's not that she's mean. She's not. In fact, Gran says she's positively daft with her money. It's just that she disapproves of zoos. Hates them, in fact. She says the animals are cramped and miserable and bored silly. And now almost everyone's got a colour telly. There's no excuse for zoos at all, and she won't support them. "I'm not asking you to build a new east wing for the monkeys," I said. "I just want to borrow 10p elk money off you, that's all. 10p isn't going to keep the zoo gates open, is it?" "I'm sorry," said Mum, "I really am, but you know how I feel about zoos, so I can't lend you your elk money." "But, Mum, if I haven't got 10p, I'll be in trouble." "I'm sorry, Minna, but the answer's no." I must say I was pretty shocked. Wouldn't you be? Your very own flesh and blood prepared to drop you in the soup like that, rather than lend a miserable old 10p. Extraordinary. In fact, so extraordinary that I thought about it all the way to school that morning. I couldn't help it. I was trying to work out just what it was about the lives of animals in zoos that so offended her. And maybe I did drift off into a bit of a daydream about what it really would feel like to be a gorgeous, powerful wild tiger locked up forever in a small pen and yard no larger than somebody's back garden. And maybe I did make believe a little that I was a baby chimpanzee, chock full of beans, and couldn't ever swing any higher or wider than the top of the cage or the sides of the cage. Maybe I did get thinking really deeply, and slow down walking and start to drag my feet a bit along the paving stones and take my time, wondering. I didn't know I was going to be that late, did I? And there was absolutely no need at all for Mr. Russell to say in quite so waspish a tone of voice, "I've had quite enough of this, Minna. Last week you said you had a dental appointment and disappeared for the entire afternoon. On Monday you turned up so tired I could see the bags under your eyes. Today you're horribly late, and on top of everything you've even forgotten to bring in your elk money. Now I'm going to send a note home with you today, asking your mother to come in to school tomorrow morning and have a little chat about things." My eyes must have gone as round as saucers. I simply couldn't think what good he thought talking to my crummy mummy would do. But there's no accounting for teachers, so I just kept quiet. I did try to get Mum to dress sensibly for the meeting, though. Not the Angora top with the puff sleeves and the low bosom, I told her, and not the purple scalloped wellies, not the plastic viper necklace, and no yellow eyeshadow, please, Mum. Mum put her head inside a Tesco paper bag. I suppose you'd like me to go into school like this, she said. That's nice, said Crusher Maggot. That really suits you. I sighed. At times it's like living with two small children, honestly it is. I did what I could. I hid some of the worst of her clothes and jewellery and set my alarm clock for half an hour earlier the following morning. As soon as I was dressed, I went and stood in the doorway watching her sternly while she chose her clothes. She knew I meant business. She saw the steely look in my eyes. She didn't argue, and when we walked into school she looked practically normal. Right, I warned her between gritted teeth. Whatever he says, whatever, nod and agree. Promise. Promise, said Mum. Credit where credit's due, she does mean well. Mr. Russell clearly thought so, anyhow. He was quite taken with her. They spent a lot of time together, laughing and chatting outside the staff room door. I peeped down the corridor twice, and both times Mum was obediently nodding. Mr. Russell was so bewitched, he even handed her his morning cup of coffee, the one he says he needs so badly he'd have to prop his eyelids apart with matchsticks if he didn't get it. And when he finally came back alone into the classroom, he leaned over my desk and whispered in my ear. What a nice mum you have, Minna. Very cooperative. She's so prepared to be helpful that when I asked if she'd come on the Friday field trip to the zoo to see our elk, she nodded and agreed. I buried my head in my hands. I could have wept. We had a blazing row about it when I got home. Why did you say that? I shouted at her. Why did you say you would come with us to the zoo on Friday? You know you won't. You can't bear zoos. So you know you can't go. When Mr. Russell invited you on the trip, why did you simply nod and agree? But that's exactly what you told me to do, Minna, she retorted. That's what you made me promise, nod and agree. But not to go to the zoo. Whatever, you said. Whatever he says, nod and agree. Sometimes I feel like despairing, truly I do. But what on earth will we do when Friday comes? We'll think of something between us. Well, let's think now. So we all sat there thinking, and it was Crusher who came up trumps. He said to Mum, Why don't you send Gran along in your place? She likes zoos a lot. She can tell Mr. Russell that Crummy Dummy kept sneezing, so you thought you should keep her at home, and she has come to help instead. I know a good idea when I hear it. Brilliant, I enthused. Gran is great fun. She'd make any visit to a zoo a treat, and everyone in my class would like her. Brilliant, Mum agreed. She was relieved. She hadn't wanted to let anyone down. Brilliant, echoed Crusher. He's never been overburdened with modesty, our Crusher. And I was satisfied. But only for a while. For inexplicably, behind my back, without noticing, the most peculiar thing began to happen. I went off zoos. Honestly, just like that. Maybe it started with all that wondering I did on the way to school that morning. I don't know. But one day I was as happy to go and see our elk as the next person in the class. And on the next, you wouldn't have prized me through the zoo gates with a crowbar. I just knew the mere sight of all those miserable, penned-up bears and lions and apes would make me sick. And after the end of term, when we'd be giving up the elk money anyway, not one penny of mine would ever find its way inside a zoo again. But what shall I do tomorrow? I wailed at Mum. I've been in so much trouble in school already, and if I can't go to the zoo with everyone else, what am I going to say to Mr. Russell?" We all thought again, and once again it was Crusher who came up with the answer. "Minna," he said, "here's 20p. Go down to the shop, will you, and fetch my newspaper, please? It's pretty chilly outside, so don't wrap up well." I'm not an idiot. I got the message. "Brilliant!" I enthused. "Brilliant!" Mum agreed. "Brilliant!" echoed Crusher. I took Crummy Dummy with me in the pushchair. I wrapped her up warmly, but left my own coat off. I even wore my leaky Wellingtons. I traipsed through every puddle I could find and dawdled on every windy street corner. When I got home, it was already supper time. Crusher had cooked instant curry and tapioca pudding. He knows I won't eat either. "Mina's completely lost her appetite," said Crusher, staring at my untouched plate. "Perhaps she's about to come down with a chill." "Maybe," said Mum. She was fiddling with the pepper pot lid. "She looks quite peaky." She made a sudden movement, and the lid sprang off the pepper pot. Pepper flew out in clouds. Before I could blink, both Mum and Crusher had stuffed wads of paper tissue against their noses and mouths. They must have been keeping them ready under the table. Crummy Dummy and I sneezed. We sneezed and sneezed. We couldn't help it. Pepper was everywhere. "Dear me," cried Mum, her voice reeking with false innocence. "Minna and Crummy Dummy must have come down quite suddenly with shocking colds." "So they must," Crusher agreed with her. "What a shame. It looks as if they both will have to stay home tomorrow." "Oh, certainly," said Mum. "No question about it. No zoo trip for Minna, I'm afraid. Why, she might develop pneumonia. I'll just have to ask Gran if she minds going on the trip with the class by herself." At moments like this, I don't know why I call her Crummy Mummy. She always comes up trumps when I really need her. I can cope pretty well with most things, but it is good to have someone on your side when you feel really stumped, and she's on my side. So Friday came, and I missed all of it. Mum kept me in. She was dead firm. She even made Crusher Maggot fetch his own paper. We sat together most of the day playing cards, while Crummy Dummy bounced up and down in her cot, or crawled around the floor, stuffing bits of carpet fluff into her ear holes. I wore my rabbit slippers and 2 extra woolies in case Mr. Russell sent spies round on their way home from school to check that I was ill. Yes, honestly, he really does do that. But Gran was our only visitor. She turned up shortly after 4, pink-cheeked and radiant. She'd had a lovely time, she told us. She'd thoroughly enjoyed the bus ride. She loved the zoo, so well laid out with all those pretty little white signposts. Elsie the elk was a poppet, and as for that Mr. Russell, he was sweet. He was so sorry to hear about the colds. He hoped poor little Minna wasn't too disappointed at missing the zoo trip, and that little baby Miranda would soon be well enough for Mum to be able to get about again. All of the children, Gran said, were helpful and charming, and a very nice little boy called Henry Boot had carried her umbrella for her the whole afternoon. You couldn't have faulted the weather, and the candy floss tasted as heavenly as it did when she was a child herself. The zookeepers were friendly and pleasant, and all of the animals looked thoroughly well looked after, she must say. She'd had a splendid day. Oh, yes, splendid. And how was I? I gave the tiniest little cough. "Oh, dear," she cried, and fell all over me, cuddling and fussing. "You'd have thought that I really and truly did have pneumonia." She's a good Gran, like Mum and Crusher. She comes up trumps. So that was it. Of course, I heard the other side of the story as soon as I went back to school on Monday morning. I hadn't missed much, everyone said. They weren't allowed to climb on the railings, and they weren't allowed to buy chips or ice cream, and half of the animals were lying fast asleep at the back of their cages, and those that were outside and on their feet were pretty boring, really, not doing anything like you see on the telly. And Elsie the elk looked as if she had mange. And the candy floss had gone up to 45p for a mean little stickful. And the bus ride was rotten because the driver wouldn't let them open the windows all the way or sing at all loudly. And the only really good bit in the whole day, everyone said, was when Henry Boot threw up outside the wombat's cage. In case you're wondering, it wasn't any sudden, delicate sensitivity to the poor wombat's plight that made him sick. It was far too much chocolate. Well, there you are. As my gran's very fond of saying, there's more than one way to tell any story. I've done my best with all these, though. I hope you liked them. Minna. The end.